Hospitals always made me uneasy. Maybe it was the long, quiet hallways, or the way the fluorescent lights buzzed just a little too loud when everything else was silent. Or maybe it was the smell, the mix of bleach, sickness, and something else I could never quite name. I had taken the night shift at St. Vincent's Hospital out of desperation. The pay was decent, and I needed the money. But I won't lie, working nights at a nearly empty hospital? Creepy. Most nights were quiet. The occasional emergency, sure, but nothing too wild. That was until I started noticing something strange about room 306. It started small. Every night at exactly 3:12 a.m., the call light above room 306 would blink red. Every single night. At first I thought it was a wiring problem. Hospitals are old and stuff like that happens all the time. But when I checked the maintenance logs, I found nothing. No reports, no requests, no reason for that light to be going off. I asked the other nurses about it. Lisa, who had been working there for years, went pale the second I mentioned the room. She shook her head. "You don't want to mess with that room." I frowned. "Why?" She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should tell me. Then finally she said, "That room was shut down for a reason." Now, I'm not the type to believe in ghost stories, but the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I should have listened. The next time the light flickered on, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my clipboard and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the quiet. When I reached room 306, I hesitated. The door looked the same as the others, plain, white with a small window at the top. But the air around it felt wrong. Like the air in the room was thicker, heavier. I swallowed hard and knocked softly. "Hello? Anyone in there?" No response. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was made. The machine silent. The air still. There was no patient. I exhaled, feeling a little stupid. Maybe the call system was glitchy. That had to be it. But just as I turned to leave, I heard breathing, slow, ragged, right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The room was still empty, completely empty. But I wasn't alone. I felt something in that room, watching, waiting. I backed out slowly and slammed the door shut. That night when I finally got home, I crashed into bed. I was exhausted, but the second I closed my eyes, I was right back in room 306. In my dream, the bed wasn't empty. A man lay there, his skin gray and stretched too tight over his bones. His eyes were open, wide, staring right at me. He smiled. "You heard me, didn't you?" he whispered. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move. His voice was dry, like he hadn't spoken in years. "I need your help." I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Then suddenly I woke up. My heart was pounding. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and my phone screen lit up. It was a hospital alert. Call light activated. Room 306. I didn't want to go back, but I had no choice. I needed the job. That night, I avoided room 306 as long as I could. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., the call light blinked on again. This time I wasn't alone. Lisa was on shift. "Don't go in there," she warned. I looked at her. "What's the deal with this room?" She sighed. "There was a patient, years ago. Room 306 was his. He wasn't right. Always muttering about voices. Said he could hear things no one else could." I shivered. "What happened to him?" She didn't answer right away. Then finally she whispered, "He died." But he never left. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I should have listened, but I didn't. I grabbed my clipboard and walked to room 306. The door creaked open. The room was dark except for the dim light from the hallway. I stepped inside, swallowing my fear. I told myself the room was empty. It had to be empty. Then, the heart monitor beeped. My breath caught. I turned slowly. The bed wasn't empty anymore. A man lay there. His hospital gown was stained, his skin pale and stretched thin, his fingers curled over the sheets, his chest rising and falling slowly. He shouldn't have been there. He wasn't supposed to be there. I took a shaky step forward. "Sir?" His eyes snapped open. He smiled. "I knew you'd come." I ran. I didn't go back to room 306 after that. But every night, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the call light blinked. I ignored it, until the night I heard it. The intercom clicked on, crackling with static. Then, a voice. "Help me!" I quit the next morning, but even now, even miles away from that hospital, I wake up every night at 3:12 a.m., and I swear, somewhere in the darkness, I hear my old hospital intercom crackle to life. "Help me!" I was working the night shift at St. Vincent's Psychiatric Ward, a crumbling old facility tucked away at the edge of town. The halls were lined with flickering fluorescent lights, their cold hum the only consistent sound in the stillness of the night. I was used to the silence, the occasional moans from patients lost in their own minds, the echoes of shoes against linoleum. But that night something was different. My rounds took me to room 309, where Miss Eleanor had been admitted just a week prior. She was in her 80s, thin as a rail, and perpetually clutching the hem of her nightgown like a frightened child. Unlike many of the patients here, she wasn't violent, wasn't particularly vocal, just scared. Every time I checked on her, she would glance at the far corner of her room and whisper, "He's watching." The first few nights I reassured her, "There's no one there, Miss Eleanor. It's just your mind playing tricks." She would nod, forcing a small, grateful smile, but the fear never left her eyes. On my final night working there, I was alone in the East Wing, making my usual rounds. It was just after 2 a.m. when I checked in on Eleanor. She was awake, sitting up in bed with her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "He's getting closer," she whispered. Her voice barely carried over the hum of the overhead lights. I sighed, moving toward her to offer some comfort, but something stopped me. A feeling like walking into a room and forgetting why you went there in the first place. The air was thick, heavy, wrong. My skin prickled with the sensation of unseen eyes pressing against me. I turned toward the corner where her gaze was fixed. Nothing. Just shadows pooling where the dim light didn't reach. But then, the room got colder. A whisper, soft as wind through broken glass, slid through the air. I turned sharply, scanning for a draft, a reason, anything logical. Eleanor's grip tightened on my wrist. "You feel it, don't you?" A shiver ran down my spine. I had been working night shifts for years, had walked these halls more times than I could count, but I had never felt this before. I shook off the unease, offering her a gentle pat on the hand before stepping back. "Try to rest, Miss Eleanor. I'll be right outside." She didn't argue, just stared at me with those wide, glassy eyes. I left her door cracked open and continued my rounds, but the feeling stayed with me. When I passed the nurse's station, I took a seat, rubbing my arms against the sudden chill. And then the call light from room 309 blinked on. I exhaled sharply and stood. Maybe she needed water. Maybe she just needed to hear a reassuring voice again. I pushed the door open wider, stepping inside, my lips already forming a soft, "What's wrong, Eleanor?" But Eleanor wasn't in her bed. The sheets were thrown aside, tangled like she had tried to crawl out in a hurry. My eyes darted to the bathroom, door open, empty. Then I saw her. She was standing in the farthest corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall so tightly I thought she might become part of it. Her hands were at her sides, trembling. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. A slow dread crept up my spine. "Miss Eleanor?" Her gaze shifted, just past me. I turned, breath held, pulse hammering. At first there was nothing, just the same old shadows. But then, in the dimness, a shape materialized. A man, tall, gaunt, his outline wavering as if he were part of the darkness itself. He was smiling, Every hair on my body stood on end. I stumbled backward, my throat tightening, but before I could blink, he was gone. The room was empty. Only Eleanor remained, staring at me with hollow eyes. "Now you understand," she whispered. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. But before I left, I overheard two of the senior nurses talking in hushed voices. "She saw him," one murmured. "Like the others." I stopped in my tracks, my pulse quickening. The other nurse shook her head, looking uneasy. "They always leave after that." I wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but I knew I wouldn't get one. Some things were better left unknown. I don't know if I imagined it, if exhaustion had finally caught up with me, or if St. Vincent's had its own long-buried secrets. All I know is that I haven't stepped foot in that building since, and I never will. The first thing I remember is the beeping. It was rhythmic, steady, like a mechanical heartbeat filling the sterile air around me. My own heart, the one that had betrayed me, felt foreign in my chest, weak, heavy, unreliable. I was in a hospital. The last thing I remembered before waking up here was the crushing weight in my chest, the way my vision had blurred as I collapsed. The world had turned distant, voices fading into static. Then nothing. They told me later that I had suffered heart failure. I had been lucky. If the paramedics had arrived a minute later, I might not have made it. But here I was, connected to tubes and machines, tethered to life by wires. The first few nights passed in a haze of exhaustion and medication. I didn't think much about the strange quiet that settled over the hospital after dark. The halls, always bustling during the day, felt deserted at night. The occasional sound of a nurse's footsteps was the only reminder that I wasn't alone. At least that's what I thought. The unease started on the fourth night. I woke up suddenly, my body stiff with an unfamiliar tension. The room was dim, illuminated only by the monitor's glow and the faint, flickering light from the hallway, seeping through the gap beneath the door. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like something dragging along the floor. Slow, deliberate. I turned my head toward the door, heart pounding too fast for someone in my condition. The sound was getting closer. Scrape, pause, scrape. My first thought was that it was a nurse making rounds, maybe wheeling a cart, but something about it felt wrong. The pauses between the sounds were too long, too deliberate. Then the footsteps started, not the quick, purposeful steps of a doctor or the light, careful ones of a nurse. These were slow, heavy, almost hesitant. Step, pause, step. My pulse spiked, setting off a sharp beep from my monitor. I reached for the call button, my fingers trembling, but before I could press it, the footsteps stopped. Right outside my door, a shadow moved across the thin strip of light beneath the doorframe. At first, I thought it was a trick of my tired mind, but then it stayed there, blocking the light completely. Someone was standing there, watching. I stared, breath caught in my throat. The air in my room felt thick, pressing against my skin. My body refused to move, trapped in a silent battle between fear and logic. Then the door handle twitched. Not a knock, not a push. A deliberate testing rattle, as though whoever was outside was seeing if the door would give. I wanted to call for a nurse, to scream, to do anything, but my voice was gone. My fingers clenched uselessly at the blanket, my limbs paralyzed. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the shadow receded. The footsteps returned, retreating down the hall. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By daylight, the fear felt almost foolish. Hospitals were eerie at night, sure. Shadows played tricks, and exhaustion could make the mind imagine things. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, I casually mentioned the footsteps, watching her reaction carefully. She didn't laugh. Instead, she hesitated just a second too long before offering a practiced smile. "Hospitals can be unsettling at night," she said, writing something on her clipboard without looking at me. Sometimes patients hear things. It wasn't the words that unsettled me. It was the way she didn't meet my eyes, the way her voice was too careful, too dismissive. I wanted to ask more, but she was already moving on, adjusting my IV, checking my chart. The conversation was over before it could begin. That evening, I told myself I had imagined everything. I was wrong. The footsteps came again the next night. This time, I was awake to hear every agonizing step. Step, pause, step. I held my breath, my heart hammering as the shadow returned, stretching beneath my door. It lingered for what felt like hours, shifting slightly as if listening. Then came the rattling. Soft at first, then more insistent. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. Then without warning, the shadow slid away. Not like a person walking, but something pulling itself back into the darkness. The footsteps didn't retreat down the hall this time. They moved into the room next to mine. Then there was silence, a long, heavy silence, followed by a sound I will never forget. A gasp, then a final, shuddering exhale. The next morning, the bed beside mine was empty. The elderly man who had been there yesterday, the one who had smiled at me weakly, his body failing, was gone. The nurses said he passed in his sleep. I knew better. As the morning shift changed, I overheard two nurses whispering near my door. "It always happens around 3 a.m., one murmured. The other nodded, glancing toward my room. "And it's always the patients at the end of the hall." A shiver ran through me. I had been at the end of the hall for 5 nights now. That night, I tried to stay awake. I kept the lights on. I kept my eyes locked on the door. I told myself I wouldn't let the shadow come for me. But exhaustion is stronger than fear. At some point, my body gave in. I woke to silence. A silence so complete, it felt unnatural. I turned my head toward the door, my pulse hammering before I even knew why. The shadow was back. This time it wasn't standing behind the door. It was inside the room, a darkness deeper than the dim glow of the monitors, spreading unnaturally across the floor. It didn't walk. It glided, pressing against the edges of my bed, curling toward me like creeping fingers. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything. I couldn't. I could only watch. The beeping of my monitor quickened, my heart reacting to something far more terrifying than illness. The shadow leaned in closer. I don't remember what happened next. The next morning I woke to daylight. The room was normal again. No darkness, no footsteps. But the unease never left. When the nurse came in, I told her I was ready to be discharged. I didn't care what tests they still wanted to run. I needed to leave. She didn't argue. By the time I walked out of that hospital, the weight on my chest had nothing to do with my heart condition. It's been months now. I'm healthy. I've moved on. At least I tell myself I have. But even now in the quiet hours of the night, I sometimes wake up with the same heavy silence pressing against me. And in the dark, I swear, just for a moment, I hear the soft, dragging footsteps, still searching. Hospitals are strange places at night. By day, they are bustling, filled with voices, footsteps, the constant rhythm of life pressing forward. But once darkness settles, when visitors leave and most of the staff go home, a hospital becomes something else entirely. The quiet is unnatural, thick with something unspoken. I learned that the hard way during a night shift I'll never forget. I was working as a technician in the hospital's blood bank, a basement-level unit where few people ever came unless they had to. It was just past 2 a.m., the deadest part of the night. Most of the hospital was running on autopilot, patients sleeping, nurses moving like ghosts through dimly lit hallways, and me, alone, doing inventory among the rows of refrigerated blood. The hum of the storage units was constant, the only sound aside from the occasional creak of old pipes overhead. I had done this job for years, working the night shift without issue. But that night, something was wrong. I first noticed it when the temperature monitor for one of the refrigerators beeped, a low, soft warning. I frowned, setting down my clipboard and moving toward the unit. The temperature had dropped, just slightly below its standard setting. Not enough to be a real issue, but strange nonetheless. I opened the heavy glass door, the cold air curling around my fingers as I checked the bags inside. Everything looked normal, rows of deep red units, neatly labeled and stacked. But then I saw it. One of the bags was missing. That was impossible. I had just finished my count 20 minutes ago. No one had entered and nothing was signed out. Blood inventory was tightly controlled. There was no reason for a bag to be missing. A slow chill crept up my spine. I checked the logbook again, then the electronic records. Nothing. It was just gone. A faint sound echoed behind me, a wet shuffling noise. I turned sharply, my pulse spiking. The blood bank was a locked unit. No one came in without a badge. The room was empty, or at least it should have been. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe I was imagining things. The hum of the refrigeration units, the exhaustion of another long night. Maybe it was getting to me. And then the lights flickered, just for a second. Just long enough for the shadows in the room to shift, stretching unnaturally along the floor and ceiling. The beeping from the temperature monitor grew louder, almost frantic now. Another fridge was failing. I moved toward it, trying to steady my nerves. I reached for the handle and a soft breath sounded behind me. Not a mechanical hiss, not the ventilation system, a breath. I spun around. The room was empty, but the floor wasn't. A single drop of blood had appeared just beyond the refrigerators, glistening under the dim fluorescent lights. I stared at it. My mind raced. There was no way, no possible way it had gotten there. Blood bags didn't leak. They were sealed, secured. Even if one had burst, it wouldn't have ended up there, so far from storage. Another drop landed beside it. I followed the sound before I could stop myself, my feet carrying me toward the farthest row of refrigerators. Past the numbered shelves, past the carefully stacked units of plasma and platelets. The door at the back of the blood bank was slightly open. No one used that door. It led to the old supply tunnels, a relic of when the hospital had been built decades ago. It was supposed to be locked at all times. The light above it flickered. A drop of blood slid down the doorframe, smearing the old metal. And then, a whisper, right by my ear. I didn't think. I grabbed my radio, my fingers trembling as I pressed the button. This is James from the blood bank, I managed, my voice barely steady. I need security down here, now. The reply was immediate. James, what's wrong? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, the door to the storage room slammed shut on its own, rattling the glass in the refrigerators. And behind it, in the brief second before the lights cut out entirely, a figure, something standing in the shadows. Something that shouldn't have been there. The radio crackled in my hand. James? Are you there? James? But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only watch as another drop of blood slipped from under the door. And the whisper came again, curling through the freezing air, impossibly close. Not yours! I ran. I don't remember reaching the hallway. I don't remember pushing through the double doors, nearly knocking over a nurse on her way to the ICU. All I remember is stumbling into the nearest nurse's station, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. Security checked the blood bank. They found nothing. The logs showed no one had entered. The missing blood bag? It was back in its place, as if it had never been gone at all. They told me it was exhaustion, stress, maybe a trick of the mind. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I transferred to the day shift the next month. I never set foot in the blood bank again, and I never ever stayed in the hospital after midnight.